I'm Deborah Mobies from Whip Stitch, and if you've been following along in the How to Quilt video series, you've made a dozen quilt blocks that each measure 12.5 inches square. You've assembled them with sashing and borders to make an entire quilt top. That's a sampler quilt and ready to go. The next step is to make our quilt sandwich, and that's this episode of How to Quilt. After your quilt top is assembled, a lot of quilters lose steam. There are innumerable quilt tops hanging on skirt hangers in closets around the world, waiting for their turn to be quilted. It can be intimidating to think about doing the quilting stitches yourself because we've made this large 60-inch by 72-inch piece of sewing that now needs to be passed through the sewing machine. There are options for you if you don't want to quilt it yourself. You could send it out. There's an entire industry of long arm quilters who will receive your quilt top and backing, put it on their machine and quilt it for you and then send it back. A lot of them charge as little as a penny a square inch to quilt your quilt for you. All you have to do is schedule the time. And if you upgrade to the How to Quilt Premium Edition, we've got an interview in the studio with a long arm quilter to show you exactly what that looks like. In the meantime, I do think that every quilter should quilt at least one quilt by themselves. I encourage people to make that their first quilt. That way, should you choose to not quilt your quilt down the road, you at least know what you're missing. I really enjoy doing my own quilt. In fact, this one is sitting over a chair right now. It has just finished being quilted here on my home machine. It is queen size, it is very heavy, and it was actually a real joy to put together. The technique that I'm using is the one that I'm going to show you right now. I'm here with all of my essential tools for making a quilt sandwich. I've got my, well, we're going to call this the quilt top. I'm using a printed fabric to indicate a quilt top rather than a piece of patchwork because we're working on a scaled down version here. So I've got my quilt top, I've got my batting, and then I've got my quilt back. Your quilt back will almost certainly be pieced from more than one portion of fabric. Unless you are making a quilt that is less than 45 inches wide, you're going to need to put two pieces of fabric together to make your quilt back. You can do that by doing a 45 by a 45 and just stitching them at the middle to make enough length for your quilt back. So if our quilt is 60 by 72, we need our quilt back to be 65 by 77. We want to give ourselves a couple inches on each side. So you could stitch a seam right down the middle to make your quilt back. Some quilters prefer to do that in thirds, so they'll take a 45-inch wide piece of fabric. They'll take a second cut and break it down the middle and stitch it to either side of that first piece of fabric so they have seam lines running down left and right rather than down the center of their quilt. Either way, you're going to need a piece of backing fabric. For my sampler quilts, I showed this back when we were doing fabric selection. I have a bunch of different block printed fabrics or large pieces of yardage from my stash that I thought would be really beautiful and that I'll be using for the backing for my version of the sampler quilt. Some of these you may find the backing fabric first for your quilt, and that can be the inspiration for your color palette. Others you'll go hunting as you are working with your patchwork. I have definitely found as I work through the How to Quilt video series that I dream about these quilt blocks, and that's been my experience working with the Murder Mystery quilt as well. As a lot of our quilters, as the year goes along and their quilt gets bigger and bigger, they become inspired to choose their quilt back. Most everybody is going to pick a 45-inch wide quilt weight cotton for their quilt back. And I am demonstrating that here with this scaled down piece that measures at least 2.5 inches on each side to make my quilt back. I'm working on, let's call this my floor. So let's say that in my home, I have a living room with a hardwood floor, or I have a basement with a concrete floor that's relatively clean, or I have a linoleum floor in my kitchen. I can lay out my quilt back wrong side up in order to make the base for my quilt. When I do this at my house, And I do have a basement floor that is concrete where I baste almost all of my quilts. I use painter's tape to anchor the edges. And here's why. Because as I work with my quilt, if I get wrinkles or irregularities in it, those can get quilted in and turn into pleats or irregularities or flaws in the quilt, and I really don't want that. So I start on one edge of my quilt, and then I go to the opposite edge, and I pull it tight. And I mean, I pull it tight. You can actually see the drag lines on this where I've put pressure on it. Tight but even, because I want to keep it relatively square. Certainly if I have a seam, I want that seam to stay straight. I pull it tight and I tape it down, and then I do the same thing around the sides. And I can see how for some of you, certainly for some of your families, that's weird. Like, what are you doing, quilter? Why are you painting or taping this on the floor? If you have roommates and they come into the kitchen or the living room and they see you crawling around on your hands and knees with a bunch of fabric and some painter's tape, they may have questions. That's cool. They can have questions. All right, so I've taped this all the way around. And again, this is a scaled down version, but it looks a lot like this when I do this in my house on a full-size quilt. In fact, the tape is, it's about this close together. And then I will go back and lift up a section and pull it over. I want it snug. And then I rub, because it's painter's tape, it's not gonna leave any residue or do any damage. So I can do a really nice job of getting it nice and snug on my surface. So this is my quilt back. It is wrong side up. Then I take my batting, whatever type of batting I've chosen, which is smaller on all sides than my quilt back. That's so that I'll have room to trim later and ensure that every part of the quilt itself has batting in it. I don't want any like hollow sections. So I go across the entire quilt and I smooth the batting out, starting from the center and smoothing toward the edges until there are absolutely no wrinkles of any kind. One of the things I notice when I do that is that as I smooth, you'll get like a little wrinkle and it'll push toward the edge, right? But the static cling between the two, the attraction between the fibers, really will hold the batting nice and flat in place. The quilt back, I should point out, was pressed as neatly as possible ahead of time. The batting is straight out of the package. The quilt top has also been pressed neatly and should also be smaller all the way around than the batting. This is our patchwork piece, and again, we start from the center and we smooth and we smooth and we get every wrinkle out, and the fibers really will be naturally attracted to one another and will fuse. Fuse is not the right word, but we'll hold each other pretty tightly together. Now, once the backing is anchored and down and ready to go, not everybody lives in a house where it's feasible for them to do the basting with pins on their floor. So, for example, you live in a house that is almost entirely carpet. You can't baste a quilt on carpet. It's just not a practical thing to do. Or you live in a house where it's all carpet, but you have a big patio, except it's winter. Not really feasible for you to baste a quilt on your patio in the winter. I have concrete floors in my basement studio, so I baste all of my quilts there. We also have hardwood floors, but for a lot of people who don't have hardwood floors in their home or apartment, they might have a linoleum floor in the kitchen. Like, that's the most practical, largest, flat, smooth, uncarpeted space in the home. And if it's something like linoleum, some sort of flooring product like that, which could be damaged by the point of the pins, pin basting, the technique that I'm about to demonstrate for you, probably isn't going to work for you. The way that the pins go through the fabric and the batting means they're going to hit the surface that's beneath wherever you have laid out your quilt back. And if it's linoleum or if you live in a rental, it's possible there could be some damage. The alternative for you is a product called spray basting. So spray basting, it is what it's basically hairspray. It's what it sounds like. It is applied to the backing before the quilt sandwich is assembled. So backing goes down, wrong side up, spray based. Batting goes down, spray based. Quilt top goes down, and everything sticks together, no pins necessary. I don't like the smell. I just don't like, it's a lot of spray, you know, it's a spray glue. And I don't like the odor that comes from it. There are some quilters who agree with me and also really don't like that smell. And there are others who have made the choice that the benefits they get from spray basting, so maybe they have arthritis in their knees, and the idea of being on the floor long enough to baste a quilt is impractical for them. Or maybe they live in a house where it's just not practical for them to do that. They can't put pins through fabric on their floor. They have made the choice that spray basting is a better option for them, even if they don't like the smell. And I'm sure there are some people who do like the smell, like some people like the smell of gasoline. I don't know. It is a choice for you. The point being, I don't think there are any barriers to quilting that can't be overcome. Sometimes it just involves using a different product that maybe you didn't know was out there. But quilters have thought of everything. So if there's what you see as an insurmountable barrier to you finishing this quilt, there's a solution for that. From here, our job is to take that natural desire to fuse to one another and make it permanent. If you're not using a spray basting product, we're going to use safety pins. There are lots of different ones that you can get. There's a pretty standard safety pin in a larger size, standard safety pin in a smaller size, and there's also what's called a quilter's safety pin, and this one is curved on both parts. And here's why that would be. Because when we're quilting, I'm going to reach down through the layers and bring that pin back up and fasten it. This is called pin basting. And the idea here is that I am securing all the layers together as snugly as I can so that later when I'm at the sewing machine, I can quilt it with no shifting or movement. I've tried to keep my quilt top, my patchwork, as square as possible to the quilt backing as I was putting it down. And I don't want to shift so that there's any portion of the quilt that doesn't have batting in it. Securing it with these pins means that the quilting stitches can go through all of my layers without shifting the layers in relationship to one another. We call it basting because it's temporary. We're not going to sew over these pins. We're going to remove them as we go, but put the stitches in their place to permanently hold these layers together. So the quilt back is stabilized on the floor. The batting is on top. The quilt top is on top, and we've pin basted. Keep in mind that for most batting, there's an indicator on the package that will tell you the distance, the maximum distance between pins. So the batting that I use, Warm and Natural is the brand. It's just my preference. There are lots of brands out there. Some of them are even fusible battings where you can use heat to hold it together in a similar manner to a spray basting. The one that I use, the maximum distance between pins for pin basting is 3 inches. So about the width of my fist, I need my pins to be at least that close together. So it is kind of, you spend some time crawling around on your hands and knees, getting these pins in, but my results have always been so good, they were more than worth it. So for this scaled down sampler here, I'm not putting these pins 3 inches apart. They're a lot closer together than that. But I mean, I do want you to keep in mind, they're not that much closer. A fist width is probably, here. So for a larger quilt, I just finished one for me and my husband. That is a queen size quilt. It's a lot of pins. This bag is just enough to baste a queen size quilt. It's just a lot of safety pins. I keep mine in this bag. You can actually find a tutorial to make this nested storage tote on the Whip Stitch blog. And I keep all my pins in there all the time. So as I'm quilting, I'll be taking these pins out one by one and I'll be putting them back in the bag. That way when I'm ready to baste, I can just pick the bag up and move it to whatever part of the floor I've chosen to put my quilt on. Once that step is complete, I am ready to take the tape off and square up my quilt because it's ready to take to the machine. With that finished, we can remove our tape, which was only necessary to hold the backing in place while we put our basting pins in. So the tape all comes up, and you end up with kind of a wad of painter's tape that goes away. And once it comes up and the tension releases, you can really begin to understand why keeping that backing so taut is really important. This then is our quilt sandwich. You can see why they call it a quilt sandwich. All of my basting pins have gone all the way through the backing, through the batting, through my patchwork here. And now your quilt sandwich is ready. In the next episode of How to Quilt, we're going to tackle straight line quilting with a walking foot.